Hello, families. Welcome back to the American Family Survival Network. I'm your host, Jeffrey Snipes. Today's article comes to us from Andrew Hoffman over at milesfranklin.com. When all else fails, they take you to war. Generally speaking, the tenor of my commentaries reflects the severity of my beliefs and recently fears, which is why the past few weeks have spawned some of the deepest and most serious articles of my career. To wit, in the past 2 days alone, I published the most important article I've ever written regarding my staunch belief that all hope for America will be lost if Hillary Clinton is elected. And frankly, I'm terrified on how rapidly civility is collapsing in this historic political campaign, which is rapidly turning into the most polarizing political event since the Vietnam War, and perhaps given the ugly direction things are turning, the Civil War. Not to mention last week's mark this date, global war has begun, of how politically, economically, and monetarily the every man for himself syndrome has taken hold. To that point, frankly, it's difficult to envision a scenario where major military confrontations do not result. To that end, we are less than 4 weeks from what will unquestionably be a major inflection point in American and global history. Frankly, even my mettle is being weakened as the relentless media attacks on Trump explode, whilst criticism of the Clinton cabal is essentially non-existent, depicting just how brainwashed, bribed, and entitled the exceptional states of America have become, despite a mountain of evidence that its best days long ago passed, with its unequivocally worst days dead ahead. In the case of the 1%, the unprecedented wealth disparity they have enjoyed has caused them, led by criminal quote-unquote leaders like the Clintons, to become so drunk on ill-begotten wealth and power they will do anything to maintain it. As for the 99%, they have become so dependent on the nanny state and so impoverished mentally and financially, they've all but given up. Which is exactly why authoritarians like the Clintons continue to receive votes, despite the indisputable failure of their policies, not to mention a record of criminality and abuse of power that Trump couldn't match on his worst day. That said, I still hold out hope that Joe and Jane Sixpack will stand up to the tyranny next month, irrespective of the near-term uncertainty and likely chaos a Trump victory would undoubtedly bring. As frankly, the difference between hope for an American resurgence and a guaranteed trip to the quote-unquote second world will be decided November 8th. I'll get to today's principal topic momentarily, a natural extension of the ominous trends noted above. However, today's horrible headlines, or better put, PM bullish, everything else bearish, are so ugly and diverse, I'd be borderline negligent to ignore them, particularly in light of their at least indirect and in many cases direct relationship they have to today's ominous topic. Starting with the two biggest lies and the powers that be propagandized, market-manipulated world today, that number one, Deutsche Bank's catastrophic collapse has been averted, and number two, OPEC actually plans to cut production. Regarding the former, after selling $4.5 billion of bonds this week at, for all intents and purposes, junk bond yields, it's difficult to believe Standard & Poor's can hold out on its inevitable downgrade of DB's credit rating to junk status, particularly in light of last week's revelations that number one, it's being sued by Italy for falsifying Banca Monte Paschi's books, and number two, that same fraud has been discovered in the accounts of at least 30 other DB clients. Number three, the ECB fraudulently allowed DB to pretend it passed its recent stress test. And number four, despite the quote-unquote rumors like the one that prompted a 25% stock surge, within minutes of it trading below the €10 share level that likely would have triggered its toxic cocoa bonds, quote-unquote. DB hasn't even come close to settling with the U.S. Department of Justice. To that end, this morning's quote-unquote hiring freeze announcement alerted the world anew that despite the new quote-unquote liquidity from the junk bond proceeds, DB's financial situation could not be more precarious, which is probably why the stock is free-falling anew, as it prepares for its final death spiral in the coming months or weeks. As for the latter, the evidence supporting the truth I discussed the second the fraudulent quote-unquote production freeze announcement was published. Example, there never was an agreement and never will be, is piling up as rapidly as mainstream attacks on Donald Trump. Yesterday, for instance, we learned the latest quote-unquote informal meeting of energy ministers ended with Russia's Rosneft, the world's largest private oil producer, unequivocally stating it would not cut production. whilst OPEC ministers dithered about with whether any production cut was possible unless non-OPEC nations like Russia cut beforehand. In other words, a complete mess of failed propaganda in a world where, oh yeah, OPEC and non-OPEC production just hit all-time high levels last month, whilst global trade collapsed at an accelerating rate. Don't believe me? Well, just last night, China, the world's largest manufacturer, announced an utterly massive, way worse than expectations September export plunge of 10%. And what do you know? The PBOC devalued the yuan again to a fresh 7-year low, mere days after it was included in the IMF strategic currency basket, quote unquote. Speaking of crashing currencies and global war, how about the UK pound plunging to its lowest level against a basket of global currencies in the nation's roughly 1,000-year history? This, as the historic London housing bubble is bursting. The BOE is dramatically expanding QE, and the European Union is demanding a whopping €20 billion Brexit divorce settlement under the guise of works in progress, quote unquote, approved by the UK whilst still in the EU. In other words, anyone who thinks the UK hasn't been hammered by the Brexit as much purposefully as inadvertently is whistling past the graveyard. To that end, just as the case will be with America if Hillary Clinton loses, the UK's short-term pain will be unprecedentedly intense, no matter how much better the long-term prognosis looks. And did I mention yesterday's September 21st FOMC minutes publication, which, as always, I write in quotes, as unquestionably they are doctored to suit current market conditions as part of the Fed's and now OPEC's de facto quote-unquote new FOMC statement each day propaganda strategy. As expected, their usual rhetoric of rate hike quote-unquote imminence was at a fever pitch. And yet the same boilerplate quote-unquote data dependency language couched its supposedly hawkish intentions, which wasn't helped by the past 2 days' data in which the Fed's quote-unquote favorite employment indicators, the JOLTS hiring-firing survey and its own quote-unquote labor market conditions index, both plunged to Hades, let alone they're all but admitting what I have shouted from the rooftops for years, which is they are in fact more quote-unquote market-dependent than anything else, and espousing that stock and bond market volatility increased somewhat in the last few days before the FOMC meeting as market participants focused on central bank communications in the U.S. Too bad they didn't also discuss precious metal quote-unquote volatility, as I assure you, it's as much a consideration as anything else. Anyhow, the net result is the same bluster as always about the quote-unquote imminent tightening that cannot and will not ever occur, as if per what happened when they arrogantly attempted to raise rates last year, amidst far stronger economic conditions than today. They attempt such an egregious act of blatant political suicide as another rate hike. Not only will global financial markets collapse, whilst precious metals surge, but the dollar will explode against nearly all currencies, the vast majority of which are already trading at near or in many cases well below previous all-time lows, which in turn would not only destroy whatever's left of the U.S. economy, but catalyze an utter explosion of foreign bond defaults, which is probably why November quote-unquote rate hike odds have plunged below 10% with December, and the Fed's warped Keynesian view being its last chance to quote-unquote save face if crashing the global economy with a quarter-point rate hike can be considered saving face. Amazingly, the quote-unquote market actually believes a December rate hike is forthcoming, which again, I write in quotes due to my strong suspicion that like quote-unquote election result odds, the Y are rigged to foster the perception of economic strength, particularly ahead of an historic election. Back to today's principal topic, one of the principal reasons, amongst countless others, that precious metals are being so viciously attacked every second of every day, with every semblance of a rally met with fresh waves of naked shorted paper, which thankfully has started to produce a material supply response, is because the drumbeats of war are growing louder each day. I mean, just how much more obvious can it be that Hillary Clinton's Washington wants war with Russia? In its latest and likely grandest attempt to scapegoat the commies, quote unquote, for our own policy failures. First, in publicly blaming Russia for WikiLeaks reported hacks of the Democratic Party archives. Next, of quote-unquote humanitarian atrocities in Syria, resulting in the outright severing of U.S.-Russian diplomatic ties. And now, exhorting equally politically desperate quote-unquote allies to join the quote-unquote war effort, including France, where soon-to-be deposed President Francois Hollande canceled a meeting with Putin, supposedly due to Russia's NATO veto of a French-proposed Syrian no-fly zone. And the UK, which ordered Royal Air Force pilots to fire on any Russian jets considered quote-unquote hostile. This on a day when the U.S. entered another war in Yemen, where it fired on anti-Saudi Arabian rebels, one day after a WikiLeaks revealed Hillary Clinton's personal belief that Saudi Arabia, a major Clinton Foundation contributor, has been funding ISIS. And 1 week after Congress unanimously enacted a law enabling 9/11 victims' families to sue the Saudi government. I mean, just last week, U.S. General Mark Milley, in a speech that could have come from a bad movie script, belligerently warned, quite obviously, Russia specifically, that I want to be clear to those who want to do us harm and destroy our way of life, and those of our friends and allies, the U.S. military will stop you, beat you harder than you have ever been beaten before. We will destroy any enemy anywhere in time, quote unquote. Prompting in turn Russia to engage in a massive quote-unquote bomb shelter drill with 40 million citizens, whilst repatriating thousands of Russian children studying abroad and moving nuclear-armed missiles to the Russian-Polish border. This, as Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov responded to the U.S. bellicosely by espousing, quote-unquote, it's not just rhetorical or Russophobia, but aggressive steps that really hurt our national interest and pose a threat to our quote-unquote national security, prompting Duma leader Vladimir Zhirinovsky to urge Americans to vote for Trump or quote-unquote risk being dragged into a nuclear war. In other words, it could not be more obvious that the same direction the global economy is taking, led by the horrific, historically damaging actions of the Fed, is being followed politically, monetarily, and with increasing likelihood militarily. As the saying goes, when all else fails, they take you to war, quote-unquote, which clearly is rapidly moving from quote-unquote possible to quote-unquote probable to quote-unquote fait accompli status. And if you can't motivate yourself to protect your assets from the inevitable quote-unquote fallout under such dire circumstances, I'm not sure what more it will take, other than the equally inevitable financial collapse, at which point it will already be too late. Folks, please go to the AmericanFamilySurvivalStore.com today for all your family's emergency and survival needs. And please remember to protect and safeguard your family. Fear not, and God bless. Thank you so much.